There are films that entertain, and then there are films that fundamentally alter the DNA of an entire industry. Batman Begins is the second kind. When it arrived in the summer of 2005, audiences didn't fully realize they were witnessing the beginning of something that would reshape Hollywood's relationship with superhero storytelling for the next 2 decades. On the surface, it looked like a reboot of a franchise that had stumbled badly in the late 1990s. But beneath that surface was a machine of extraordinary precision, built on creative risks, unconventional decisions, and a level of obsessive craftsmanship that most viewers never consciously noticed. The secrets embedded in this production are not just interesting trivia. They are the hidden architecture of a masterpiece. And to truly understand how this film became what it became, you have to go back to the very beginning, which in this case means going back to a 2-car garage in the suburbs. Before Warner Brothers had fully committed to the project, before casting announcements and studio greenlight meetings and multi-million-dollar pre-production budgets, the earliest creative vision for Batman Begins took shape in Christopher Nolan's own garage. The director and screenwriter David Goyer began developing the story in this stripped-down domestic environment, sketching out ideas without the pressure of executive oversight or the noise of a Hollywood development process. Production designer Nathan Crowley soon joined them, and together the 3 men began experimenting with architectural concepts, narrative directions, and even early vehicle designs using model kits and spare parts sourced from toy stores. What sounds like an amusing anecdote is actually the origin story of the film's entire creative philosophy. Without a formal studio setting, without boardrooms and pitch decks and committee feedback, the team had room to think freely and take genuine risks. The rawness of that environment planted seeds that grew all the way through to the finished film, and you can feel that hands-on spirit in every frame. Security around the production was equally unconventional. As the script developed and its secrets deepened, Nolan took extraordinary measures to protect what was on the page. Warner Brothers executives who wanted to read drafts of the screenplay could not simply receive email PDFs or take home physical copies. Instead, they were required to visit Nolan's home in person and read through the material under his direct supervision. No photocopies left the room. No digital files were distributed. The reason for this extreme approach was specific and deliberate. The script contained a narrative twist of significant power, namely the true identity of Ra's al Ghul, a revelation that would lose all of its impact if it leaked to an internet audience hungry for spoilers. This was 2005, and online speculation around blockbuster films was growing at a rapid pace. Nolan understood that protecting the surprise was not paranoia, but strategy. When the film finally reached theaters, every audience member experienced that twist exactly as intended. The payoff was undeniable, and the approach set a new standard for blockbuster secrecy that studios would spend years trying to replicate. Finding the right locations was just as deliberate as protecting the story being told within them. For Wayne Manor, the production team settled on Mentmore Towers in Buckinghamshire, England, a breathtaking 19th century estate originally constructed for the Rothschild family. The choice was rooted in the film's core philosophy. Rather than building a facade on a studio lot, Nolan wanted Bruce Wayne's ancestral home to carry genuine history, real weight, and a kind of lived-in authenticity that no constructed set could fake. The towering rooms and aristocratic architecture of Mentmore Towers gave the Wayne family legacy a tangible foundation, communicating old money, quiet power, and generational isolation without a single line of dialogue needing to explain it. The cast and crew who walked those halls weren't performing against a manufactured backdrop. They were inhabiting a space that had existed for well over a century, and that invisible layer of reality translated directly to the screen in ways audiences felt instinctively, without being able to name. The same commitment to authentic location carried through to one of the film's most atmospheric settings. The Arkham Asylum sequences were filmed inside the Midland Grand Building at St. Pancras in London, a Victorian Gothic structure of extraordinary character that had ceased operating as a hotel all the way back in 1935. At the time of filming, it sat in a state of partial disuse, its interiors faded, and its atmosphere genuinely eerie in a way that only old, neglected grandeur can be. Rather than constructing an asylum set from the ground up, Nolan allowed the location to do the emotional heavy lifting. The decaying elegance and unsettling stillness of the Midland Grand gave Arkham a sense of dread that would have taken enormous resources to manufacture artificially, and even then might not have felt as convincing. The building wouldn't reopen as the Street Pancras Renaissance Hotel until 2011, 6 full years after the movie was released. In the gap between its former life and its future one, it briefly became Gotham's most infamous institution, and it was perfect. Gotham itself was never a single place. Creating a city that felt simultaneously familiar and mythic, recognizable yet belonging to no specific geography, required Nolan and production designer Nathan Crowley to draw from multiple real-world cities simultaneously. Chicago, New York, Hong Kong, and Tokyo all contributed architectural DNA to the film's version of Gotham. The Narrows, one of the story's most critical settings, drew particular inspiration from the dense, claustrophobic verticality of Kowloon in Hong Kong, a district where buildings crowd so tightly together that natural light becomes a luxury and the streets feel like tunnels through an urban canyon. That layered, multicultural approach to city design was a conscious departure from earlier interpretations of Gotham, which had often leaned on theatrical stylization and exaggerated expressionist sets. By grounding the city in recognizable global architecture, Nolan made audiences believe that Gotham could actually exist somewhere in the real world. And that belief became the psychological foundation on which the entire trilogy was eventually built. The visual identity of the film was also shaped by one of cinema's most iconic dystopian visions. Nolan has spoken openly about the influence of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner on the atmosphere and mood of Batman Begins. The rain-soaked streets, layered shadows, and brooding noir-inflected lighting that define Scott's classic can be felt throughout the darker sequences of Nolan's film, where Gotham pulses with the same kind of atmospheric dread. The homage went deeper than visual tone, casting Rutger Hauer, one of the most recognizable faces from Blade Runner, in a supporting role was a quiet but intentional acknowledgement of that cinematic lineage. It wasn't fan service or nostalgia for its own sake. It was a filmmaker signaling his influences with intelligence and restraint. What Nolan borrowed from Scott wasn't a science fiction setting or the futuristic technology. It was the idea that a city itself could function as a character, that atmosphere could carry emotional weight, and that restraint in visual storytelling could be more powerful than spectacle. That philosophy shaped every decision in the production. Choosing the right antagonist for a grounded superhero reboot was one of the most consequential creative decisions the film had to make. Rather than reaching for a villain defined by theatrical flamboyance or superhuman spectacle, Nolan selected Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul, two characters whose power derives from psychology and ideology rather than physical dominance. Fear was not just a weapon in this story. It was a narrative engine driving every scene, every character arc, and every thematic thread. Bruce Wayne's journey begins in childhood terror, deepens through his years of training, and culminates in his decision to become fear itself, to weaponize the thing that once paralyzed him. Every major character in the film orbits around this single unifying idea, giving the movie a psychological depth and internal coherence that most genre films never achieve. This thematic discipline elevated Batman Begins beyond the conventions of comic book storytelling and into territory that felt genuinely cinematic, where the real conflict was always internal and external action was merely its expression. The commitment to psychological realism extended all the way to the production's approach to action and visual effects. At a time when digital effects were rapidly becoming the reflexive default for big-budget filmmaking, Nolan made the deliberate choice to prioritize practical work wherever the story allowed. Collapsing sets, real vehicle crashes, and large-scale physical destruction were executed on location or on carefully constructed soundstage setups, rather than generated inside a computer. The philosophy was simple but demanding. If something could be done for real, it should be. CGI was treated not as a creative starting point, but as a last resort, used when practical alternatives were genuinely impossible. That discipline gave the film a tactile, physical quality that audiences could feel in their bodies, even when they couldn't intellectually identify why the action felt so different from other blockbusters of the same era. Explosions carried real danger. Impact had genuine weight. The world around Bruce Wayne felt like it could break, because much of it actually did. Nolan's hands-on approach extended to the direction of action itself. Major studio productions routinely hand off action sequences, stunts, and large set pieces to dedicated second-unit directors, a common and entirely reasonable practice that keeps massive productions on schedule. Nolan refused to follow that model. He personally directed virtually every significant action beat in the film, maintaining creative control from the quietest dramatic exchange to the most physically demanding stunt sequence. His reasoning was clear. The action needed to feel emotionally connected to the rest of the story. A fight scene or a chase sequence that existed in a tonal vacuum, cut off in the psychological weight of the surrounding narrative, would undermine everything the film was trying to build. By overseeing every element of production himself, Nolan ensured that no sequence ever felt inserted purely for spectacle. Everything flowed from the story, and the story flowed through everything. Even the film's technical choices were guided by a preference for authenticity over modernity. At a time when digital intermediate color grading was rapidly becoming the industry standard, the production used traditional photochemical film processing instead, a technique that had defined cinema for decades but was quickly falling out of fashion. This wasn't nostalgic stubbornness. It was an aesthetic statement. The photochemical approach gave the film a distinctly grainy, analog texture that set apart from the increasingly polished, digitally processed look of other superhero productions released during the same period. Every frame carried a subtle rawness and natural imperfection that felt more like a gritty crime thriller from the 1970s than a contemporary comic book adaptation. Audiences may not have been able to articulate why the film looked different, but they felt it. That organic quality contributed enormously to the grounded, believable atmosphere that Nolan was constructing on every other level of the production. Not every effect in the film was practical. The production understood that certain moments, particularly the surreal hallucinatory imagery of the Scarecrow sequences, required digital tools to achieve their full psychological impact. The maggots that appeared to crawl across decaying faces during these nightmare scenes were entirely computer-generated, composited carefully into live-action footage to blend seamlessly with the actors' performances and the practical lighting on set. What makes this choice interesting is how it reveals the true sophistication of Nolan's approach to visual effects. He wasn't anti-digital for ideological reasons. He was against using digital tools as a substitute for imagination and practical craft. When CGI served the story, when it created something that would genuinely be impossible to achieve otherwise, it had a clear and legitimate role to play. The maggots worked precisely because they appeared in the context of deliberate unreality, where the rules of the film's grounded world had temporarily been suspended to explore a character's psychological terror. The casting of Bruce Wayne himself was far from the certainty it now appears in retrospect. Christian Bale's path to the role was genuinely uncertain. Studio executives at Warner Brothers had serious reservations about his commercial viability, questioning whether an actor known primarily for intense, lower-profile dramatic work could carry a tentpole blockbuster of this scale and financial exposure. His name didn't come with a built-in box office guarantee, and the studio was understandably cautious. What ultimately convinced Nolan to fight for Bale was the actor's audition and the deeply psychological interpretation of Bruce Wayne he brought to it. Rather than playing the character as a confident, untouchable billionaire, Bale leaned entirely into the trauma, the obsession, and the fractured identity beneath the mask. That approach aligned precisely with the emotionally complex, grounded version of the story Nolan was committed to telling. Without Bale's raw intensity and psychological depth, the film's realistic tone might never have landed with the same weight, and the entire trajectory of the trilogy could have been fundamentally different. Large sections of Gotham's street-level world were built inside the Cardington airship hangar in Bedfordshire, England, a colossal industrial structure originally constructed to house military airships in the early 20th century. Its extraordinary size gave the production the space to build entire city blocks with complete control over lighting, atmosphere, and environmental conditions. The team incorporated the hangar's existing structural elements into the design with remarkable ingenuity. Massive overhead beams and industrial framework were woven into Gotham's visual architecture, becoming part of the city's identity rather than obstacles to work around. This blend of real industrial space and purpose-built set design gave the streets a layered, lived-in quality that felt far more authentic than a purely fabricated environment ever could. The cast and crew weren't imagining their surroundings or performing against bare green screens. They were walking through a version of Gotham that physically existed around them, and that immersion produced more convincing performances and a more believable world. The training sequences filmed in Iceland brought an entirely different kind of physical authenticity to the production. The real ice fields and glacial environments of Iceland doubled as the remote wilderness, where Bruce Wayne begins his transformation, and the cast and crew who traveled there endured genuinely brutal conditions throughout the shoot. Freezing temperatures, unpredictable weather, and challenging terrain were constant realities that could not be softened or controlled. But that hardship produced something that no studio environment could have offered. The cold breath visible in every exhale, the squinting against icy wind, the sheer physical discomfort embedded in the footage were completely real, and audiences feel that rawness on screen even if they don't consciously register its source. The landscapes carry a primal, almost mythic quality perfectly suited to the spiritual and physical rebirth Bruce undergoes during his training. No soundstage or digital backdrop could have delivered the same sense of vast, indifferent nature pressing in from every direction. The design of the Batcave presented one of the production's most interesting technical challenges. Lighting an underground space convincingly without making it look like an obvious studio set required a creative solution embedded in the environment itself. The team built simulated natural light sources directly into the cave's architecture, using cracks in the ceiling, cascading waterfalls, and subtle gaps in rock formations to justify the illumination in ways that felt organic to the space. Rather than positioning studio lights where they were most convenient and hoping audiences wouldn't notice, the lighting logic was integrated into the cave itself, making every source of illumination feel like a natural consequence of the geography. The result was a Batcave that felt genuinely subterranean, dark and damp and cavernous, yet still visually accessible enough for audiences to follow the action and appreciate the space's scale. It avoided the polished, brightly lit look of earlier interpretations and delivered something that felt carved out of real earth. The Batmobile's origins were as humble as the garage where the film's creative vision first took shape. Early design concepts for the vehicle were assembled by hand using off-the-shelf toy models and spare parts, the same crude, improvised approach that characterized the earliest stages of the entire production. The goal was to move decisively away from the sleek, stylized Batmobiles of previous films and create something that felt like it could exist in the real world. The resulting design leaned heavily into military aesthetics, angular armor plating, aggressive proportions, and an engineering logic that made the vehicle look less like a superhero prop and more like a prototype weapon from a classified defense program. What is remarkable is how much of that original garage-built DNA survived into the final vehicle. The raw, utilitarian spirit of those early toy part prototypes carried all the way through to the full-scale machine that tore through Gotham streets on screen. The sequence that showcased that machine most memorably was filmed on Lower Wacker Drive, Chicago's underground roadway system, transformed into a high-speed corridor control chaos for one of the film's most thrilling set pieces. Real stunt vehicles, practical lighting, and meticulously coordinated crash sequences replaced digital augmentation and slow-motion enhancement. Nolan opted for raw kinetic realism. Cameras capturing the action at full speed in confined, dimly lit environment of actual urban tunnels. The physical weight and unpredictability of the sequence came directly from the real danger embedded in every frame. No green screen could replicate the natural tension of genuine speed and genuine risk in a genuine space. The result was one of the most viscerally effective practical driving sequences in modern superhero cinema. Hans Zimmer's approach to the film's score was as unconventional as every other creative decision in the production. Rather than crafting a sweeping, bombastic orchestral theme of the kind traditionally associated with superhero cinema, Zimmer built Bruce Wayne's musical identity around a motif of just two rising notes. The deliberate simplicity was the point entirely. Bruce Wayne at this stage of his journey was not a triumphant hero. He was something still becoming, a character in the process of transformation, not yet fully formed. A grand, complete theme would have contradicted that incompleteness. Instead, the two-note motif mirrored the character's evolution, growing in complexity and emotional intensity as the story progressed, earning its full expression only as Bruce moved closer to embracing what he was becoming. By the time the motif reached its most powerful statement, audiences felt the cumulative weight of everything the character had endured. Zimmer proved that restraint in musical composition could carry as much emotional force as any sweeping orchestral statement. The film's final moments deliver one of cinema's most precisely calibrated sequel teases. A single playing card sealed in an evidence bag, bearing the image of a grinning Joker, placed in the closing minutes of a movie for which no sequel had been officially confirmed. There was no greenlit trilogy waiting in the wings. There was no guaranteed continuation. Including the Joker card was a genuine creative gamble, a quiet escalation hint that trusted audiences to understand its promise without spelling it out. If the film had underperformed, that moment would have remained an intriguing, open-ended footnote in a franchise that went no further. Instead, it became the spark that ignited one of the greatest cinematic sequels ever made, and one of the most celebrated performances in the history of film. That single card, placed with absolute confidence in the final scene, quietly changed the landscape of superhero storytelling forever. What all of these secrets reveal, taken together, is not a collection of isolated curiosities, but a unified portrait of a creative philosophy applied with extraordinary consistency across every dimension of a major studio production. From the garage where the first sketches were made to the Icelandic ice fields where the training sequences were filmed, from the two-note musical motif to the photochemical processing that gave every frame its analog texture, the same principle governed every decision. Authenticity, no matter how difficult to achieve, always pays off on screen. Christopher Nolan didn't simply revive a struggling franchise. He demonstrated that depth, restraint, and psychological complexity could be just as thrilling as spectacle, and that the hardest creative path was almost always the right one. The film proved that taking genuine risks, protecting genuine surprises, and demanding genuine craft from every department was not just artistically admirable, but commercially viable in ways that changed what the entire industry believed was possible. More than 2 decades later, the blueprint it established is still being followed, still being studied, and still setting the standard for what superhero cinema can aspire to become.